Okay. Myrna, I'm glad you didn't mention that it is a beach town in Michigan we share. Because native Michiganders prefer for people on the East Coast and West Coast just to think of Michigan as flyover country, right? It's something you only fly over when you're going from San Francisco to New York. When in fact the Lake Michigan beaches, I can assure you, are much, much nicer than the California beaches. So sorry to all you native Californians. Thanks for turning out this afternoon. As you know, my talk precedes the State of the Union address. So I'm sure you're all missing your pre-State of the Union parties. Even more importantly, 5 minutes ago, Michigan tipped off against Purdue in a basketball game. And in about an hour and 25 minutes, the Blackhawks face off against the Nashville Predators. So I have my priorities straight. I normally start this talk with some disclosures. My first disclosure is that I am easily the least accomplished speaker of the semester. I always marvel at the scholarly talent that this lecture series brings to Sonoma State. And as Myrna mentioned, I'm a graduate of the University of Michigan. It's where I spent my undergraduate years. It's what really made me want to become a historian and spend my life in the academy. And I miss that environment a lot. There's a lot to be said about what happens to students at a small liberal arts school like Sonoma State, but without a question, you miss out on certain things that happen in places like Berkeley and Madison, Wisconsin, and Ann Arbor, Michigan. But this lecture series, I think, is emblematic of the sort of thing you would have at a big public research university. So we're fortunate to have it here. My second disclosure, as Myrna indicated, is that I am not a historian of Germany or the Holocaust. I'm a historian of Russia and the Soviet Union. So I'm an outsider to this field. This is always really convenient for me because if I'm asked any questions, I can deflect them to the other experts in this room. And if you do have questions, feel free to ask during my talk or save them to the end, whatever you prefer. But just because I'm an outsider doesn't mean I haven't thought about the Holocaust in my own work. In fact, there's a good deal of theoretical overlap between the scholarship on Stalinism on one hand and Nazism on the other. And they are joined by the concept of totalitarianism. And do we have any political science majors in here? Brave person. So in your poli-sci courses, do you talk about totalitarianism anymore?
Yes.
Yeah, and what is it exactly?
It's essentially where the organs of state exert complete and total control over every aspect of society.
Yeah, so the word comes to us from two political scientists at Harvard 50 years ago, even more than that now, 60 years ago. They were trying to decide what the affinities of regimes like the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were, and they came up with a model. And I can't remember all the characteristics of the model. But the gist of it is that these regimes have total control. Okay, so historians long ago figured out that this is an embellishment at best, that these regimes never had total control. They had totalizing ambitions, however. That is, they sought to control every aspect of the lives of the citizens over which they rule. Okay, and that's an important difference, totalizing ambitions. And so it's become common to speak of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany as the two fullest realizations of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century. Now, Stalinism and Nazism are also linked with the concept of genocide, although I think less frequently and in my mind less satisfactorily, since I don't think the Soviet Union was ever genocidal. And here we have to distinguish between killing lots of people and genocide. The Soviet Union certainly excelled at the former, probably not the latter. And by the way, the comparison between Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia is one where the Soviet Union comes out looking pretty good. And this highlights one of the great ironies of 20th century history. And that irony is a communist country saved the capitalist world from its own successes by defeating Nazi Germany. And here in America, we commonly hold the naive view that the United States was the victor of the Second World War. I can assure you that is not the case. By almost any standard, any index we use, the Soviet Union was the principal victor over fascism. Now, it's also true that the Holocaust was primarily an Eastern European and Soviet event. And this is important because in the West, in the United States in particular, our image of the Holocaust tends to be one of Vichy collaborators and Anne Frank holed up in her attic in Amsterdam. But the truth is the vast majority of persons who perished in the Holocaust resided in the East. So if we include in our calculation Polish territories that were annexed by the Soviet Union in 1939, about half of the total victims of the Holocaust were Soviet citizens. Now, it's also true that the heartland of European Jewry, what was called the Pale of Settlement, is in the present-day countries of Ukraine and Belarus. These were part of the Soviet Union. And actually, the Holocaust left the Pale of Settlement almost entirely devoid of Jewish inhabitants. So I guess that's what qualifies me to speak about the Holocaust. There is some overlap with the field I know really quite well. Now, if I were to ask you what the Holocaust was, I'm confident that every one of you could answer. You would say something to the effect that the Holocaust was the event whereby German soldiers and German political leaders and bureaucrats and their non-German abettors planned and implemented the systematic murder of about 6 million Jews and then smaller numbers of Roma. Who are the Roma? Gypsies, yeah. Smaller numbers of Roma, Slavs, handicapped persons, homosexuals, and communists. Now, as such, the Holocaust is the central event in all of German history. It is the central event in modern European history. And here I have in mind the time frame from the French Revolution in 1789 to the present. So the Holocaust is the central event over that more than 200-year period. The Holocaust colors our understanding of what it means to be German and European, and it forces us to rethink events as pivotal in European history as the Enlightenment. And I'll talk a little bit about that today. Everybody knows what the Enlightenment is, right? Okay, so what's the Enlightenment? I saw some nodding heads. My students especially, shame on you if you don't know what the Enlightenment is. Okay, so the Enlightenment was this event in European history. It's impossible to put exact time frame on it, roughly 1650 to 1800. It was a philosophical and political awakening whereby philosophers and enlightened political leaders like Catherine the Great and Frederick the Great tried to apply rational scientific law to the realm of politics. So the Enlightenment, among other things, gave us the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The Enlightenment, paradoxically, also gave us Auschwitz. And I'll try to make the case for that today. And I guess most important, the Enlightenment gave us the idea, and this is no doubt an idea that many of you subscribe to, that human existence can be improved and even perfected. In fact, historical positivism, the view that the present is better than the past and the future will be better than the present, is largely an Enlightenment product. Okay, so I'm confident you would all know what the Holocaust is. But if I asked you why the Holocaust happened, I suspect you would find it much more difficult to answer. Right? I mean, in effect, what I'm asking you is why did hundreds of thousands of seemingly normal, intelligent, and otherwise moral Germans participate in mass murder? And then why did millions and millions of their countrymen do nothing to stop it? Now, as the historian Daniel Jonah Goldhagen pointed out a few years ago, your answers to that question would probably have as much to do with the nature of human existence, what Joseph Conrad called the heart of darkness, which supposedly resides in all of us. So your answers would have more to do with that than with the individual motivations of persons who participated in mass murder. So I'm not so naive to think that we are going to answer this question today. In fact, I'm fairly confident that if this lecture series is so lucky to survive the next 100 years, students will be sitting in those same seats you're in, debating this same question, why the Holocaust happened. But I do want to provide you today with a few conceptual tools you can use to try to answer this question on your own, and then the historical background that it will be necessary for you to formulate your own response. So I'm going to identify three structural developments that, in my mind, facilitated the Holocaust, made the Holocaust possible. And then I'm going to move on to the specific circumstances under which the Nazis came to power in Germany and how they went about persecuting Jews. Okay? So, and then I'll conclude with some thoughts on how historians have tried to make sense of the Holocaust. So, my first structural reason for the Holocaust is, for lack of a better term, anti-Semitism. And a previous speaker in this lecture series, Yehuda Bauer, who's professor of history at Tel Aviv University, said that this is a stupid term, anti-Semitism. It's stupid because there is no doctrine of Semitism to be opposed to. There's nothing to be anti to. Nonetheless, in its common usage, anti-Semitism refers to animosity towards Jews. But surprisingly, not toward other Semitic peoples, like Arabs. Okay? So Jews and Arabs are both Semitic. But anti-Semitism in its popular usage refers to animosity towards Jews. Now, in some forms, anti-Semitism is as old as Christianity itself. Many verses in the New Testament strike the modern reader as anti-Semitic. There's a reason for this, that they probably reflect tensions in the early Christian movement between Jews who converted, Jews who accepted that Christ was the Messiah, and Jews who did not. But much of the Christian anti-Semitism hinges on the idea that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ. Now, according to the book of John, Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor of Jerusalem, was ready to pardon Christ, but was convinced otherwise by a hostile Jewish crowd. According to the book of Matthew, Caiaphas, who was the Jewish high priest in Jerusalem, helped fabricate evidence against Christ. And this is, of course, is what got Mel Gibson in trouble with his movie The Passion of the Christ. But I should point out here that a full reading of the book of Matthew suggests that Caiaphas did this in order to stave off a Roman military incursion. Right? So you sacrifice one person in order to save many. But nonetheless, as a result of this, until the 20th century, it was accepted doctrine in the Roman Catholic Church that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ. And this alone was often the cause of popular animosity towards Jews. So when the plague hit Europe in the middle of the 14th century, there were persistent rumors that the plague was caused by Jews who had poisoned the water supply. By the way, how is the plague transmitted? Yeah, actually, the fleas live on the rats. That probably came with travelers on the Silk Road. There were also rumors all across Europe that Jews used the blood of Christian children in their Passover matzahs. Does everybody know what a matzah is? Sometimes mistaken for a frisbee, big square piece of unleavened bread, particularly unedible. Along with Muslims, Jews were targeted by the Crusades in the 11th through the 13th centuries. Jews were objects of the Inquisition, that is, that agency in the Roman Catholic Church that persecuted heresy. In the 12th and 13th centuries, Jews were repeatedly expelled from France. They were expelled from Spain in 1492. They were expelled from parts of Prussia. That's Prussia with a P, not an R. Prussia was the predecessor to the modern German state in the 1700s. And in the Russian Empire, where many Jews who were displaced from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492 eventually settled. In the Russian Empire, they were confined to residence in the Pale of Settlement. That is, these territories in Belarus, Ukraine, and actually part of Poland, too. I didn't mention that earlier. In large parts of Eastern Europe, Jews were forbidden from owning land. And this gives us that most pernicious stereotype of Jewishness, right? Jews as money lenders. In fact, I had, many years ago, I had a landlady in Russia. She couldn't say Jew or refer to Jews without doing this. And this referred, I think, to the exchange of money. But of course, in every stereotype, there is a kernel of truth. And the reason this stereotype exists is because Jews were forbidden from owning land, right? And so if you can't farm the land like nearly everybody else, you make your money through commerce and speculation by running the local tavern or feed store. Unexpected or unexplainable tragedies frequently resulted in what was called a pogrom. This is a Russian word, which means little storm. It refers to a popular uprising against Jews. So my point here is that anti-Semitism has been with us for a very long time. But that does not mean that anti-Semitism has been the same over the centuries. In fact, it's changed a great deal. Over the course of the 19th century, anti-Semitism became less religious in orientation and more racial. And this reflected two important developments in European history. First of all, Jewish lives were increasingly urban. So many Jews were no longer practicing. Men did not wear beards and the yarmulke, as the book of Leviticus specifies they should. In the Russian Empire, movement in and out of the Pale of Settlement was increasingly tolerated over the course of the 19th century. And then the switch from religious to racial anti-Semitism also reflected many pseudo-scientific theories that were in vogue in the 19th century that attributed certain defining physical and mental characteristics to ethnic and racial groups. And whether or not we want to admit this, we've all heard these stereotypes before, right? Englishmen are individualistic. Germans are punctual and efficient. Irishmen are drunkards. How are Americans perceived? Yes, sadly, we are perceived as loud and obnoxious and increasingly overweight. That is the stereotype we have in Europe. Okay, and now I actually have a slide here, so let's see. Forward. Can you flip forward one slide there? Oh, here we go. So here you see one of these classes in racial science that's being taught in a German elementary school in the late 1930s. This is after the Nazis have come to power. And so presumably this child here is being taught what the defining characteristics of the different racial groups are, and you see that up there on that poster. So Jews were also associated with certain characteristics, but they were unsavory to say the least. Jews were perceived as greedy, as rootless, and as cosmopolitan. And this is that adjective cosmopolitan is very interesting because today, of course, it's a compliment to be called cosmopolitan. It means you're sophisticated and you're worldly. But in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, the values were reversed. Cosmopolitanism suggested that Jews had little loyalty for the nations in which they resided, but instead pledged their allegiance to various transnational groups like the Jewish diaspora or political movements like Zionism. Right? And Zionism is Jewish nationalism. It's the movement that preceded the formation of the modern Israeli state. Or sometimes Jews were seen as communists. So you may have noticed that there's a contradiction here. Some people are perceiving Jews as greedy, and some people are perceiving Jews as communists. So is it possible to be a greedy communist? It seems to me those are oxymoronic. These terms are mutually exclusive. You can't be a greedy communist. But I think this is emblematic of what the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman has called the viscosity of Jewish identity. And this is an interesting noun he's using, viscosity, right? Because it's usually something we only encounter when we buy motor oil, right? Viscosity is a measure of slipperiness. And what Bauman is pointing out is that for anti-Semites, Jewish identity was always slippery, right? Jews can be arch capitalists on one day, greedy in the extreme, and the next, they're conniving atheistic Bolsheviks. Okay? Now, this is hardly an exhaustive list of the indignities that Jews were subjected to, and it's not meant to be one. But I do want to make one point here that the historian Jan Gross makes in his study, the way the Holocaust played out in a small Polish village. And that is, before the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, from the perspective of Jews, was a lot like an intractable, low-intensity war. Okay, so Jews, particularly in Eastern Europe, had to be savvy in order to survive. So a moment's carelessness, a casual glance, an unprovoked insult could produce a pogrom. But the point is that a low-intensity war was survivable. What was so extraordinary about the Holocaust is that in all but a very few cases, the Holocaust was not survivable. Okay? So that's my first structural reason for the Holocaust. My second structural characteristic that contributed to the Holocaust was nationalism. And this requires a little bit of explanation, what nationalism is and what nations are. So nationalism is a doctrine, and we know that because it ends in ISM. And if you do your New York Times crossword puzzles, if you ever see the clue creed or doctrine, and the answer is 3 letters, it's always ISM. So nationalism is a doctrine that holds that each nation should have its own state. It's very rare that when you ask somebody to define nationalism, they will do it in one sentence. But I have just given you a one-sentence definition. Nationalism is the doctrine that each nation should have its own state. And of course, nations are groups of people that imagine that they have some affinity with each other. And imagine is the important verb because it's never the case that every member of a nation knows every other member of a nation. Right? It's an imagined community, as the historian Benedict Anderson pointed out. And that imagined affinity can be language, it can be culture. In fact, language and culture is what defines the French nation. It can be ethnicity, it's what defines the German nation. It can be creed, it's It's what makes us American, supposedly. It can be some combination of language and religion, what traditionally defines membership in the Russian nation. It doesn't matter how it is defined. Nations are defined. Now, despite what nationalists say, nations are relatively recent phenomena in world history. And nationalists often argue that nations have roots in the very distant past. So Mussolini claimed that the roots of the Italian nation stretch back to ancient Rome. But this is simply not the case. Even the oldest nations have only existed for about 200 years. Many of the nations in Eastern Europe are a good deal younger than this. So in Western Europe, the signal event for early nationalists was the French Revolution in 1789. And the French Revolution is important because, among other things, it located political sovereignty in a broad citizenry, that is, property-owning males, rather than in a narrow aristocracy or in the royal family. Now, in Central and Eastern Europe, where territories were incorporated into multinational empires like the Russian Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or where there were lots of petty semi-independent principalities like Germany before Bismarck, nationalism was shaped in important ways by a cultural movement called Romanticism. Romanticism, we may have some sense what this is. I should confess here that I have an aunt, F. Roseanne Bittner, who is a romance novelist. You often see her novels at the checkout lane. She makes way more money than I do. And that's part of how Romanticism was understood in the 19th century, but that's not the entirety of it. In its broadest sense, Romanticism refers to a movement in art, in thought, in cultural sensibility, in which feeling and imagination are emphasized instead of science and rationality. Okay, so feeling and sentimentality instead of science and rationality. And so in this sense, Romanticism is a response to the Enlightenment and to the scientific revolution. In fact, historians often refer to Romanticism as counter-Enlightenment. By the 1750s, the notion of historical progress, this idea that the present is better than the past, was firmly entrenched in Europe. Historical positivism appeared to have been further verified by the American Revolution in the 1770s and the French Revolution in 1789. Now, Romantics were deeply skeptical about this all. Romantics were anxious about the extent and the pace of cultural change. Romantics were skeptical of science. Romantics were skeptical about the claim that man had mastered the secrets of nature. Modern conservatism actually comes to us in large part from Romantic thought. Okay? So, Romantic nationalists like the poet Johann Gottfried von Herder and the composer Richard Wagner celebrated folk culture as the only constant in this sort of sea of change that was 19th century Europe. So, in other words, if you wanted to discover what it meant to be authentically German, you didn't go to the cafes and salons of Hamburg or of Berlin. You went into the peasant village, because there the kernel of authentic Germanness was uncorrupted by modernity. Of course, there's an irony here. These Romantic nationalists like Herder and Wagner were polyglots. They spoke many different languages. They were worldly in the best sense, except for Wagner, he was an anti-Semite. And they idealized the lives of illiterate peasants. This is often an affliction of the intellectual. Now, as a political doctrine, nationalism was and remains one of the most successful of all times. Over the course of 100 years, Europe ceased to be a continent of empires, and it became a continent of nation states. That is, states that base their right to exist on the will of a nation. So I'm going to go through a list here, and it's probably not important that you write this all down. It's more important that you understand that this is one of the most important events going on in Europe during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So Serbia gets limited autonomy in 1815, full autonomy in 1918. Greece becomes a nation state in 1829. Romania in 1859. Italy in 1861. Germany in 1871. Bulgaria in 1878. Albania in 1912. Czechoslovakia in 1918. That's an unusual one, right? Because it's a state of two nations. Actually, it didn't last, right? It was partitioned in the 1990s, 1994. Poland, 1918. Latvia, 1918. Lithuania, 1918. Estonia, 1918. Hungary, 1918. Ukraine was independent in 1918, 1919. And then Turkey becomes a nation state in 1923, the remnants of the old Ottoman Empire. By the way, why so many birth dates in 1918? What's going on in the world in 1918? Yeah, World War I has come to an end. And interestingly, both Woodrow Wilson and Vladimir Lenin naively believed that nations had the right to self-determination. There's been so much trouble in this world caused by that naive belief. So nationalism also caused problems. When these nations were born, the borders that were drawn between nation states were rarely perfect. So there were Romanians who lived in Russia. There were Ukrainians who lived in Poland. There were Germans in Czechoslovakia. There were Turks in Bulgaria, and so on, and so on, and so on. In fact, the handout that you have shows that in virtually all of these Eastern European countries, there were sizable Jewish populations. And Jews are unique here because they have a nationalist ideology, right? Zionism, but they do not have a nation state. Okay? So that is my second structural reason for the Holocaust. Any questions? Okay, so moving on. My third and final structural characteristic that facilitated the Holocaust is militarism. So after 1870, every major European power maintained a standing army. That is an army that exists in peacetime. And every power was spending increasing sums of money on weapons production. So military spending more than doubled in France between 1875 and 1914. During that same period, it tripled in Britain and Germany. And in Russia, by 1914, the military accounted for a full 1/3 of the state budget. Even by American standards, that's an awful lot of money. On the eve of World War I, there were some 19 million men and a pretty sizable number of women as well in uniform on the continent. And more importantly, military thinking and military values had begun to pervade European society. Technology spurred this along. The French introduced the machine gun in the 1860s. New industrial processes made possible the development of far larger and more accurate artillery pieces. By 1914, the Germans had artillery that could launch a shell 75 miles. Iron bottoms, that is, ships that are built out of steel instead of wood, revolutionized naval warfare. By the early 1900s, a new vessel had come into use. The British call it a dreadnought. We call it a battleship. It's essentially nothing more than a floating artillery platform. And then even more ominously, nations began to experiment with the use of chemical arms. and there was widespread use of chemical arms in the First World War. And then I think even more importantly, the very idea of violence became culturally acceptable. So Marxists on the left, social Darwinists on the right, liberals, racists, everybody thought that the struggle between peoples was historically necessary. And so patriotism disappears in the years leading up to and during the First World War, and it was replaced by jingoism. That is a very belligerent form of nationalism. It's not only we're great, it's we're great and you suck. And this enthusiasm for violence was manifested in extremely low rates of desertion once the war actually began. For instance, the French command anticipated a desertion rate between 5 and 13%. Right? It was really easy for French soldiers to desert. They could often just walk home. In reality, the desertion rate turned out to be 1.5%. Okay. Is anybody watching Downton Abbey in here? Yeah. You're watching it? Yeah. Yeah, well, it's fantastic. I highly recommend it. Judy, you must be watching it, right? You're not watching it? Oh. See, that's what I tell people, but the truth is I actually do watch television. But anyway, some fantastic depictions of the front in the First World War. Okay, so let me move on then to the specific circumstances under which the Nazis came to power in Germany. So Nazi success built upon the failures of German liberalism, in particular the failures of what was called the Weimar Republic. And Weimar was the city where the new German constitution was drafted after Germany's capitulation in the First World War. And so the political entity that was born out of Germany's defeat in the First World War was commonly called the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic lasted until 1933. And during this period, it was arguably the world's most democratic state. Now, Weimar also had many weaknesses, and I think the one that everybody knows are the onerous reparations that were placed upon Weimar by the Treaty of Versailles. I actually think that was less important than the fact that Germany's first civilian government was forced to sign the disgraceful peace of or Treaty of Versailles. And those of you who've taken some of my courses in European or world history know that World War I was really unusual. It's not quite the case that the British and the Americans and the French won the war. It's just more the case that the Germans got tired of fighting it. So it was a very strange sort of victory. So we have the Treaty of Versailles, and then Weimar was also plagued by extreme political polarization. For instance, on the very same day that Weimar came into existence, Armistice Day, November 9, 1918, German socialists declared the formation of a pro-Soviet socialist republic. So actually, November 9th marks the birth of two states, and then invariably a fight over which state would actually exist. In 1920 and 1923, there were right-wing uprisings in Weimar that capitalized on popular disenchantment over the economy. In the summer of 1929, the American economy slipped into recession. In October of 1929, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. Europe collapsed within weeks of the United States. After the crash, American financiers were no longer able to continue infusing capital into European economies. By 1932, American investment in Europe had fallen by 70%. And this was particularly difficult for Germany because Germany depended on loans from American banks to pay its war reparations. Now, not surprisingly, Germany was the first state to experience political upheaval. In parliamentary elections in September of 1930, German voters stunned the pundits by handing 107 seats to the National Socialist Party. So this requires a little bit of explanation. 107 seats. there are 611 seats total in the German parliament. So 107. It's a sizable bloc, but certainly far from a majority. But what it meant is that overnight, the Nazis, as these National Socialists were called, went from being an inconsequential party to being the second largest bloc in the Reichstag, parliament. So it appears that the Nazis were the prime beneficiaries of the mounting economic crisis in Germany and in Europe. Now, of course, the Nazis were led by Adolf Hitler. Hitler was born in Austria in 1889. As a young man, he had dabbled as a painter. Sadly, he was denied admission to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. If only he had gotten in. He served with the German infantry in World War I. He twice received the Iron Cross, the German equivalent of the Purple Heart, for surviving poison gas attacks. Now, after the war, Hitler joined the Nazi Party. He was not the founder of it. So he joined this National Socialist Party. And the name of the party requires a little bit of explanation. Socialist was not meant to be understood in the Marxist sense. Rather, it was meant to connote the feeling of solidarity that German veterans of the First World War supposedly had for each other. So the sense of solidarity in their sense of betrayal that workers on the home front had grown exhausted and capitulated. They were the cause of German defeat, not anything that happened in the trenches. In 1923, Hitler was arrested for participating in a coup against the Bavarian government in Munich. The coup plotters were caught, really, before any damage could be done. But nonetheless, Hitler was sentenced to 9 months in prison. And it was while he was in prison that he wrote the book that would become the Bible of the Nazi movement, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And in this book, Hitler laid out his view of history. So unlike Marx, who thought that history was pushed along by struggle between classes, Hitler argued that history was the product of racial struggle. So there was a master race. Hitler called them the Aryans. They were the predecessors of the Germans and the Brits. And this master race was ordained by God to be the implacable foe of lesser races, particularly the Jews, but also the Slavs and the Roma, and essentially everybody to the east of Germany. Now, according to Hitler, Germany had to adopt an aggressive foreign policy in order to achieve its historical destiny. So he thought that the German army had to conquer essential Lebensraum, living space, in Eastern Europe. And he realized that this expansion would probably anger France, Germany's traditional ally, Germany's traditional enemy in the West. But he naively thought that the British would never send troops to stop it. Because after all, the Brits were also part of the master race. So these are the core elements of Nazi ideology. We have racial superiority on one hand, and we have the need for expansion on the other. And these really provided the basis for future Nazi policies. Now, Hitler, can you flip forward one more slide there and back? Okay, so Hitler came to power almost by accident. Despite the impressive showing of the Nazis in the 1930 elections, they were still only the second largest party. They played second fiddle to the Social Democrats, the center-left party in the Reichstag. By 1932, the Nazis had become the strongest party in numeric terms, but still far from a majority. The Nazis had 230 of the 611 seats in the Reichstag. And there's some evidence that suggests that in late 1932 and 1933, the Nazis were losing their support to their arch rival on the left, the Communist Party. So in other words, people who had previously voted for the Nazis were switching. And this is proof that we don't have a political spectrum, we actually have a political circle. Right? You go far enough left, you actually come back right, and far enough right, you come back left. So I think many astute analysts were saying at the end of 1932 and beginning of 1933 that the Nazi phenomenon appeared to be waning. Now, ironically, the Nazi seizure of power can be attributed in part to the commitment among social democrats to liberal bourgeois ideas. And among these liberal bourgeois ideas that we cherish are freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. And there were many people in Weimar who thought the solution to Nazism is to simply ban the party, to outlaw the party. Now, Paul von Hindenburg, the German president, refused to do this because he saw it as a violation of liberal ideals that he held dear. But clearly something had to be done about the Nazis. And the solution seemed ingenious at the time, but in retrospect, I think we can say without doubt it is one of the great historical clusterfucks of all time. Hindenburg offered Hitler the chancellorship in 1933. Now, as chancellor, Hitler would rule over a coalition cabinet that contained only 3 Nazis among 11 seats. And in the eyes of Hindenburg and others, once in power, Hitler would have to tone down his rhetoric and he would have to behave more responsibly. And it's probably not unreasonable to expect this of politicians, right? Politicians say lots of absurd things when they're running for office. For instance, just today, Newt Gingrich, whose Twitter feed I follow, tweeted that he was going to mount sniper rifles on satellites. I'm not joking. He tweeted that.
Personally, is he going to do it?
I don't know how that is going to be done, but there was this belief that Hitler would act more responsibly once he was placed in power, and there was even a belief that he could be controlled like a puppet once he was named chancellor. Now, once he was in power, Hitler moved quickly to consolidate his position. He demanded first that new elections be held for the Reichstag in March 1933. This was his prerogative as chancellor. But on February 27th, 1933, the Reichstag building burnt down. The fire was probably set by Nazi arsonists, but Hitler blamed the communists. By noon of the following day, 4,000 communists had been arrested, and Hitler had signed an emergency decree which suspended individual liberties. In the ensuing days, Nazi thugs terrorized their political opponents, and this set the stage for a Nazi triumph in the Reichstag elections on March 5th, 1933. The Nazis won 44% of the vote. Still not a majority in the Reichstag, but they had allies in the Nationalist Party, which gave them effective control over parliament. Less than 3 weeks later, at the end of March, the Reichstag approved what was called the Enabling Act, which authorized Hitler's government to rule by decree for 4 years. So it's basically parliament emasculating itself. So Hitler had become a dictator, really over just a couple of weeks, even though a majority of the German population had not voted for his party. Now, 2 factors made the Nazi expansion so rapid. First, the Nazis relied on the work of the Gestapo, later the SS, the secret police. And secondly, thousands of bureaucrats and state officials joined the Nazi Party because they were opportunists, because they realized that they could advance their careers by doing so. Now, the traditional institution that was most likely to give Hitler trouble was the army. We know that the leading generals in the German military had little respect for Hitler. But of course, military support was absolutely essential for Hitler's aggressive foreign policy. So Hitler resolved this by accusing leaders of the so-called SA of homosexuality, and he ordered the secret police to assassinate them on June 30, 1934. And this event will become known as the Night of Long Knives, the night of assassination. In July of 1934, Paul von Hindenburg, the German president, died of natural causes, and Hitler combined the offices of chancellor and president. Now, effective opposition to the Nazis might also have come from the Christian churches. If you look at who voted for Nazis in the elections of 1933, the typical Nazi voter tended to be Protestant and middle class, so Protestant bourgeoisie. But nonetheless, most Protestant clergymen tried to remain politically neutral. And a very small number of Protestant clergymen organized an active resistance to Nazism. And some 800 Protestant clergymen died in concentration camps during the Nazi period, including the most famous among them, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who at the end of the war is resurrected as the German hero above all others, the sort of great resistor of Nazism. In 1933, Hitler signed a treaty with the Vatican in which Pope Pius XI gave his stamp of approval to Nazism in return for a recognition from Hitler or a promise from Hitler that he would respect the traditional confessional liberties that Catholics had enjoyed in Germany. So among other things, what this treaty did is it undermined the ability of the Catholic Center Party, which had delegates in the Reichstag, to oppose Hitler's government. And beside the point, Hitler's assurances to the Pope proved to be largely meaningless. In the mid-1930s, Nazis ruthlessly attacked Catholic schools and Catholic youth groups. Pope Pius eventually decided that his 1933 treaty was a terrible mistake. He did this in a 1937 encyclical called With Burning Sorrow. But by then, Nazism was firmly entrenched. Now, some of the most interesting recent scholarship on the Holocaust concerns the sort of intersection of Roman Catholicism and genocide. Sadly, Pope Pius XI was more hesitant to attack Nazi anti-Semitism. And there are probably good reasons for this. The Roman Catholic clergy in Poland, for instance, was bitterly anti-Semitic. And so it would have been highly unpopular for Pope Pius to attack anti-Semitism. Now, Nazi racism was directed primarily against the Jews. In 1933, after coming to power, Hitler expelled most Jews from state administrative positions. 2 years later, he issued the infamous Nuremberg Laws. Among other things, the Nuremberg Laws denied German citizenship to persons with 2 or more Jewish grandparents. So that becomes the official legal definition of Jewishness, right? 2 or more Jewish grandparents. The Nuremberg Laws prohibited marriage and sexual intercourse between Germans and Jews. It required Jews to wear a yellow Star of David in public. German towns could refuse residency to Jews. And German businesses were forced to fire their Jewish employees. Now, Jews weren't obtuse to what was going on here. But by 1938, more than 100,000 German Jews had fled abroad. If they were lucky, they fled to Switzerland or the United States, someplace where the Wehrmacht wouldn't eventually get them. But all too often, they fled somewhere where they were later caught up in the gears of war. On November 8th of 1938, those Jews who remained behind were subjected to Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Can you flip forward one more slide? Scores of Jews were killed. Thousands were dragged from their homes and beaten. 200 synagogues were burned. 7,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed. Paradoxically, Hitler's government blamed German Jews for the disturbances, and some 25,000 Jews were incarcerated because of Kristallnacht. Go forward one more slide, please. Now, these early attacks on Jews were part of the disemancipation phase of Nazi policy. Disemancipation, meaning the sort of denial of civil liberties to Jews. Now, what made the Nazi program so unique was their subsequent attempt to annihilate Jews through rather methodical genocide. Now, Hitler wanted Lebensraum, living space in the East, and according to Heinrich Himmler, this would require the annihilation of 30 million persons of Slavic origin. Fortunately, the Nazis regarded these people as subhuman. To this end, Himmler authorized special SS action teams that followed closely behind the Wehrmacht. And go ahead, one more slide. And when they arrived in a village, they would typically go to the local priest or the local police chief and ask who is Jewish, who's communist. They would line these people up. Typically, they were forced to dig their own graves. Then they were lined up on the rim and they were shot. Millions of Soviet citizens died in this manner. Some 3.7 million Soviet prisoners of war were likely executed in this manner. Now, even lower than the Slavs in the Nazi racial hierarchy were the Jews. And Hitler was determined to eradicate as many of the 11 million Jews who lived in Europe as possible. So soon after the outbreak of the war, on September 1st, 1939, when the western half of Poland was invaded, Jews in Poland were herded into ghettos, first in the city of Lodz, and then in Warsaw and other cities. Go forward one more slide, please. It was from the ghettos that many Jews were sent to be killed in concentration camps. The ghettos weren't supposed to be machines of genocide themselves, but the living conditions were so poor in ghettos that the death rates by 1942 hovered around 20%. So every year, 20% of the population of the ghetto would perish. Now, at first, the ghettos were seen as a temporary expedient to isolate Jews from the rest of the human community while their ultimate fate was determined. In July of 1941, Hermann Göring, at Hitler's command, issued the fateful order for the mass murder of Jews. In the order, it was phrased as a total solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. The following January of 1942, Nazi leaders met in a Berlin suburb, Wannsee, to map out plans to deport Jews to camps that were specially equipped to exterminate large numbers of people in as efficient a manner as possible. Execution by machine gun was determined to be too costly and too efficient to carry out. So the preferred method was the gas chamber. And the gas chamber had several advantages. After death, dental fillings could be removed. Anything of value on the body could be removed. Corpses were burned in crematoria. Bones and ashes could be used as fertilizer. Some corpses were boiled to produce soap. The most notorious of these camps was at Auschwitz in Poland, in southern Poland, outside of Krakow. Go forward one more slide, please. German scientists perfected a form of cyanide called Zyklon B. But even at its most efficient, Zyklon B took between 15 and 20 minutes to kill its victims. Now, at first, Allied and Jewish leaders were incredulous at the reports of the genocide that were filtering out of Eastern Europe. But even when these reports were confirmed, there was no effort made to either bomb the camps or to bomb the rail lines that led to the camps. There were many, many cases of heroism. Many underground church groups, mainly Protestant ones, assisted the Jews. Pope Pius XII, who was Pius XI's successor, never condemned the atrocities, even when Jews in Rome were herded onto cattle cars and sent away to their deaths. There was scant sympathy for Jews in Poland, especially among the Roman Catholic clergy. But the Danes, about whom Myrna has written, the Hungarians, the Bulgarians, the Italians, organized large underground resistance networks that saved tens of thousands of Jews from murder. But nonetheless, efforts to blame this slaughter on a mere handful of deranged Nazi leaders, right, Hitler and his dining companions, as it turned out, are really indefensible. So at the very least, approximately 50,000 people were directly involved in the mass murder that was the Holocaust. So we have German soldiers, we have politicians, we have French collaborationists, we have Polish clergy members. The list goes on and on and on. And very few of these people were ever held responsible for their crimes. Okay, so I promised you that I would end with a couple comments on how historians have tried to make sense of this all, of this carnage. And I realize, standing up here, and having done this many years, I realize that there's something kind of numbing about this all, killing on this scale. So how have historians made sense of this? Well, for the first decades after the Holocaust, debate raged between two schools of thought. And this is a scholarly dispute, so it's anything but sexy. The schools of thought were called the intentionalists and the functionalists. So let's start with the intentionalists. The intentionalists argued that the Holocaust was a product of Nazi willfulness. So in other words, Hitler was a man with a plan, right? So if you wanted to study the roots of the Holocaust, to figure out where this event arose, you would look at the origins of the Nazi Party. You would read Hitler's Mein Kampf. You would dissect the Nuremberg laws. So in other words, the Nazis had a master plan to destroy the Jews from day one, and they acted on that plan. Okay, so it was intentional from day one. The functionalists argue that there was no master plan, even though they recognize the deep anti-Semitism of Nazi leaders and much of the German and Polish populations. The functionalists argue that the Holocaust was the product of a specific confluence of events. And whenever historians say a specific confluence of events, that's always code for we really don't know what those events are, but we're sure it's really complex. But nonetheless, the functionalists emphasize rivalries within the bureaucracy. I think Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, which my students in History 202 read, can be understood as a functionalist account of the Holocaust. So they emphasize rivalries within the bureaucracy rather than the ambitions of political leaders. Okay? So in other words, the way you excelled in Nazi Germany, the way you moved up the totem pole was by killing Jews. Now, more recently, really, I think the last 20 years, there's been a tendency to look, or a willingness to look beyond this intentionalist, functionalist divide, and to try to ascertain the specific motivations that individuals had who participated in the killing. So Christopher Browning, a historian at University of North Carolina, has written a book called Ordinary Men, about how these otherwise ordinary men participated in mass murder. Daniel Jonah Goldhagen has written a similar book. Jan Gross, a historian at New York University, has even questioned the centrality of German soldiers in the Holocaust as it played out in Poland. A very interesting and short book, too. In fact, students in my 20th century European class are reading it this semester. And then last, I should conclude here by mentioning once again Zygmunt Bauman. And Bauman places the Holocaust within the broader trajectories of modernization. And Bauman, particularly because he's not a historian, so I think he has a lower empirical threshold than we historians suffer with. But Bauman privileges certain notions, ideas of the modern state that come to us from the Enlightenment. Bauman coins this phrase, the gardening state. And he argues that all modern states are like gardeners, right? States fertilize some parts of their population and they weed other parts, right? And we do this here in the United States through our immigration policy, through federal student loan programs. We sort of encourage certain characteristics among the population, discourage other characteristics. Well, Bauman argues that the Holocaust is a perverse outcome of this very same sentiment. And I know Myrna doesn't like this, but one way of thinking about this is that the GI Bill and Auschwitz are two sides of the same coin. So in other words, behind each is the same notion of modern statehood. Okay, that is the gardening state. Okay, that is all I have, so I'm happy to take questions or deflect questions.
Questions?
Yeah, Judy.
Does the modern state, does that explain why there was such a growth of anti-Semitism in the cities and the cosmopolitan Jews in the late 19th century?
Well, you know, you're forcing me to pin down cause and effect here, right? And so I think that the switch from religious to racial anti-Semitism, it does reflect events that are going on in Jewish lives, right? The fact that so many Jews are not practicing anymore, and that they don't wear yarmulkes, and they don't grow earlocks, and they don't have beards. And so the only way you can differentiate them is through this sort of pseudo-science of race that develops towards the end of the 19th century. But you know, Bauman, when he talks about modern states, he has something different in mind. And he, you know, for better or worse, modern states are all welfare states. That's right. They're states that are concerned about the welfares of their population. And this is different from, I think, the sorts of states that you study, which tend to be territorial states, right? States that exist to administer a certain territory. But around the time of the French Revolution, European states begin to transform themselves into welfare states, states that are concerned about the welfare of their population. And the way you promote welfare is through these gardening techniques of fertilization and weeding. I'm not a gardener. And of course, the Holocaust is a perverse manifestation of that weeding ethic, right? But we do it. But Bauman's point is we do it too. You know, every time an illegal immigrant is put on a bus and sent back across the border to Mexico, we are weeding. Yeah.
If I, one cannot underestimate the influence of the theories of followers of Charles Darwin. Because what happened in the 19th century was, up till that time, if you were a Jew and you said, I don't want to be a Jew anymore, baptize me, you weren't a Jew anymore. But following all of the racial theory, once a Jew, always a Jew. And that's tied in with this notion of blood. You know, as Steve said, you know, 2 Jewish grandparents pollute you forever. And this tapped into notions that were not just prominent in Austria and Germany. The eugenics movement, which was the movement to improve the gene pool, started in the United States.
Although in defense of Darwin, right? I mean, Darwin never intended for people to. I mean, he was a biologist.
But followers of
Yeah, that's right. But you know, Darwin sits alongside Marx and Christ, right? For in terms of they you know they're so central to our that they're often you know you can find a quote in the Bible or in the writings of Marx to justify just about any position you want.
No, I understand. But it was very fashionable.
Yeah, that's true.
And modern to start thinking the way that
Yeah.
Darwin was purporting to explain human evolution.
Yeah, but you know I'm writing now about Darwin. My new project is about wine and history of Russian and Soviet winemaking, and so I've familiarized myself with all of this. Darwin's theory of natural selection wasn't embraced until many decades after his death by scientists because we didn't understand what the specific mechanism of biological change was. And of course, Darwin proposed that it was natural selection, right? That's how different species come into existence. But we didn't know how specifically that happened. And it wasn't until the 1920s and the 30s when it was synthesized with Mendel's laws of heredity that it was accepted by natural scientists. And they had all sorts of wacky ideas about how the different species came into existence. Yeah?
There's actually Darwin's cousin, too, who came up with eugenics, and I forget what his name is right now, but also in Spencer, who came up with the survival of the fittest, and they kind of completely single Darwinism, which is where the characterism really came from, and
Yeah.
took all that and put it towards improving the gene pool.
Well, that phrase, survival of the fittest, is actually from Malthus, Thomas Malthus, who was an English pastor who wrote in 1802 a pamphlet called An Essay on Population. But actually, in my part of the world, in Russia, lots of Russian natural scientists rejected Darwin because of his apparent Malthusianism, that ethic, survival of the fittest. And Russians saw that as an expression of British economic liberalism, not natural law. Anything else? Yeah.
Bittner sort of saw like world struggles as like racial struggles. How does he, or how did he explain the Germans, why the Brits did not join on their side? It was based on.
Well, I don't know if he was ever forced to explain why it didn't work out, but yeah, I mean, I was trying to juxtapose Hitler and Marx, and you know, those of you who've taken political theory here at Sonoma State or any one of my classes, you know that Marx saw the struggle between classes as being the engine of history, right? It's what pushes history along. And there's even a schematic to this, right? We start off in primitive communism, and then we go to the classical slave-owning societies, and then feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and finally communism. And what pushes us from one system to the next is the sort of class antagonisms. And so Hitler is, to some degree, writing in response to that. And he's denying that it is class antagonism, it's racial antagonism, is what. And, you know, both Hitler and Marx are guilty here of historical reductionism. History is far too complex to boil down to a 7-stage schematic, or however many Marx had. So I don't know if he was ever forced to explain why the British didn't, on September 1st, why the British went to war against Germany instead of sitting on the sidelines.
Much more confusing for him was what happened in places like Denmark and also in Norway with the Norwegian resistance, because he considered them Aryan people. And supposedly, one of the things that historians have posited is that he took an easy way in Denmark to take it easy on his Aryan brothers who eventually would come home, which has its origins in the traditional struggles between the Danes and the Germans.
Yeah, although lots of Norwegians fought on the Eastern Front for the Nazis. And,
Danes too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Obviously, everything that Hitler did unfair and unforgivable, but looking at the person he was as a politician and as a military figure, couldn't you argue that he really was a military, somewhat of a genius, given everything that he did and the way that he did it and what he looked to accomplish and what he was able to do under his ideology?
Well, I mean, perhaps we can answer your question by starting with the results, what the results of the Second World War were for Germany. So at the end of the war, Germany was utterly devastated. In fact, Germany was partitioned for 4 decades. Eastern Germany was raped, and I mean that literally. Sizable numbers of East German women were raped by the Soviet Army of Occupation. Virtually the entirety of East German industrial might was packed up and put on trains and sent to the Soviet Union. And so I don't think there's much genius behind any of that. It seems to me that Hitler's claim to geniusness took a terrible blow outside the gates of Moscow in December of 1941, January of 1942, and then again at Stalingrad at the end of 1942. And then for the remainder of the war, the Germans were in retreat. And there's nothing, I think, that's commendable about a politician who gets a country involved in a war it cannot hope to win.
I think one other thing is, if you think what it must be like to be a German, and what it was like being a German, let's say, after the grandparents and the German children today, or Germans your age, the burden that they carry in terms of what their national heritage has produced, I would say that's another indication of his supreme failure.
And it's only in the last 10 years has it become morally acceptable in Germany to talk about the incredible scale of German suffering during the last years of the war and during the post-war period. That it was just that the Holocaust loomed over all of this, right? I mean, the city of Dresden, one of the centers of European culture was firebombed by the British and the Americans. Thousands and thousands of civilians were immolated at Dresden. And it was morally unacceptable for Germans to even speak about that because it existed in the shadow of the Holocaust. How can a people who has perpetrated mass murder complain about the way they are then treated by their adversaries? And of course, the result of this is Westerners, Soviets, the Allies don't have much of a grasp about our own barbarism in the course of the war, because it was all justified by the Holocaust. Actually, retrospectively justified by the Holocaust. Yeah.
How would you compare the relationship between the United States and
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Like, would you say that there's any similarities between our treatment of people of the Middle East, or Middle Eastern descent, and the wars that we're fighting there, and the Holocaust and the events that happened in Europe?
No. I mean, I'm not a defender of the way Muslim Americans have been treated in this country since 9/11. I think much of it is reprehensible, but there is a difference in magnitude here between genocide and between going through a full body search at TSA. Yeah.
Given that in the early part of the rise of the Nazi Party in the mid-30s, that, as you said, eugenics was so widely given credit in the United States, and that we had industrial leaders, and I'm thinking particularly of Ford, that looked at the fascist model as a triumph of industry and how to get an economy rolling again. Do you think that the Nazis, since fascist policy was conflated with their racial policies, looked to that and saw it as a justification to keep perpetuating this escalation of how to deal with the Jewish question?
So can you repeat the latter part of that question
Okay,
again?
so from an outside perspective, perhaps some people wouldn't look at the Nazi policies as being so intertwined with racial politics and fascist economic models.
Yeah.
But to the German, do you think that when they hear, for instance, that Henry Ford holds the successes of Germany up in the highest regard, that to them it says he's going along with the entirety of Nazi philosophy, and that might have helped to propel the escalation of the violence?
Oh boy, that's a good question.
He went along with the entirety. He was the one who propagated the
Yeah.
Ford
protocols of the Elders of Zion,
Right.
which
Ford
is
specifically was a notorious anti-Semite, but other industrialists that maybe didn't follow the anti-Semitic propaganda. So
Yeah. Well, you brought up the successes of Nazi rearmament and industrialization, and I have a friend on faculty at Brandeis University, David Engerman, who he's an American intellectual historian, but he's very savvy in the sort of European historiography. And he has pointed out that American economic thinkers in the 1930s shared many of the assumptions that influential people in both the Nazi government and in Stalin's government had. And namely, it was this sense that you needed to have a plan. Right, and so there was, in the West in the 1930s, there was this real sense that there was an existential threat to capitalism. Right, I mean, we'd just been through the Great Depression, in that the solution to this existential threat was planning. And if you were going to have a plan, there were going to be groups that benefited from the plan and groups that did not benefit. And so in Russian, there's a saying, when you chop wood, chips fly. I think in English, it is when you make an omelet, you have to crack eggs. And so that was the assumption that was shared by people in Roosevelt's administration and also people in Nazi Germany and in Stalinist Russia. That there were going to be people who would lose out. And there were losers. In this sort of struggle for modernization, there were going to be losers.
which, if I might comment, is not unfamiliar to some of the rhetoric that we are hearing in the current presidential race.
Yeah.
That some people just have to fall by the wayside for the greater good.
Just as long as it's not me.
That's right, but we're in a very precarious position, you and I and Judy.
Any other questions? Well, thank you for being a tolerant audience.